Welcome to another edition of Right Voices. I'm John Hart, the co-founder of C3 Solutions, the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, and the editor of our news magazine, C3. Today, we're honored to be joined by West Virginia Senator Shelley Capito. In 2015, Senator Capito became not just the first woman to be elected to the U.S. Senate from West Virginia, but the first Republican since 1942. Senator Capito is the ranking member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and the vice chair of the Senate Republican Conference. She's also the author, along with Senators Carper and Whitehouse, of an important new bipartisan nuclear energy bill that's moving through the Senate now called the ADVANCE Act. Senator, welcome. Thanks for taking time to visit during such a busy week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. So I think, the ADVANCE Act and what's happening in the Senate is significant on a few different levels. But I thought just to start, so people understand what the bill is, maybe you could just describe why, as a senator from coal country, why you decided to lead on the issue of nuclear energy.
Well, I think it's important as you look at the whole framework, and if we're going to look 30, 40, 50 years down the road for where we're going to get our energy and how we're going to generate our power. And I think that as I, obviously from a coal state, a natural gas state, still want those in the mix. But I know that to get baseload fuel and to get baseload capacity, which our capacity appetites are only going to grow through the years, that we really need to incorporate more nuclear technologies. And there's been a lot of innovation in the nuclear field over the last several years with small modular reactors and other technologies. But we still have a ways to go to get the process streamlined, to make sure that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has the capacity and the abilities to license these in a timely manner, because these are big investments. And also, I think too, as we look towards our own homeland security, that the security of our nuclear power generation is important. And lastly, I would say that the ADVANCE Act, which is the nuclear bill that we were able to get into the defense authorization, it's bipartisan, but it's also telling the world that our technologies are going to be the dominant technologies. We want to have global dominance here for obvious reasons, national security obviously being the biggest. So, and then I'll just kind of go back and say in my state, which obviously has a lot of coal, natural gas, power generation is exclusively coal almost. And, our legislature came to the table 2 years ago and said, look, we've got to open this up to other power generation, and nuclear should be one of them. And we have a lot of abandoned coal sites, power generation sites that, because of this ADVANCE Act and other things that are going on with the Department of Energy, you could repurpose these sites that are no longer producing and use them for nuclear purposes. So there's a whole realm of really good things for my area specifically, but also the country and essentially the world.
In the state of play against senators, this bill, it's not merely just bipartisan. It passed, I think 16-3 at the committee, and it's going to be attached to the National Defense Authorization Act. And what are the prospects of it moving through the House and being signed into law?
We feel very positive about the reaction that we're going to get in the House. And so we've been working with our House counterparts, obviously, all along the way. Anything we did as we were trying to incorporate it into this piece of legislation had to drop out some of the sticking points, so to speak. So we were able to compromise that. But there's an increasing interest. I sponsored this with Senator Carper, with Senator Whitehouse. The economic picture is still not clear, and that's part of what this is about, is incentivizing economics of it. But I think in terms of the environmental aspects of nuclear, I said there's no question it's cleaner and it's greener. And so I think we need to make sure that we incorporate that.
Yeah, so on that point, I think it's one of the takeaways, I think, from what's happening with the ADVANCE Act is it shows to the extent to which there's been a shift within the Republican Party conservative movement on climate. So I was a Senate staffer for 10 years. I was Tom Coburn's communications director, from oil and gas state. He was skeptical. And I think, true science is skepticism. But there was a shift that happened 5-10 years ago where the majority of senators, representatives in Congress would say their main focus was to push back on what they viewed as climate alarmism. And that still is an important message, is to not be alarmist. But at the same time, there's a greater realization that humans do have some role in climate change. And I think that has given Republicans an opportunity to talk about the strength of their argument on economic freedom. We've done a report that says free economies are twice as clean as less free economies. Do you see a shift in the politics on the right?
I do see a shift, and I think it's coming from different sources. Number one, I think the realization that our energy appetite is exponentially going to grow, regardless of whether you're driving an electric vehicle or not. These are our demands are just bigger and broader. I mean, the trends are there, so we have to meet that challenge. Second of all, I think we have to look at what the younger generation is thinking about. The argument's been made to them and for them that we have an issue here that we need to really seriously address in terms of resiliency and sustainability and being able to capture emissions that may be not just contributing to a rise in the temperature and all that, but may be detrimental to our own physical health and environmental health. And I mean, I think acknowledging those facts is our plain, but I think our younger generation, they don't just acknowledge the fact, this is truth to them. And I think they're experiencing it. So here's the way I look at it. I mean, I think we're smart as Republicans to be addressing these issues and to have solutions, because the solution that's missing here is any kind of transitional solution. It's either you're all one way or you're the other in the eyes of, say, President Biden, for instance. Everything has to be green, everything has to be renewable, everything has to cost more and all this. No, it doesn't. Here are our solutions. Let's use our own energy resources. Let's push innovation. Let's work in committee like we did with Senator Carper on the highway bill and say, do we need more sustainable materials? Do we need to use more natural landscape when we're building certain things? Those are very acceptable in my view, rather than piling on a bunch of cement or something like that. And I think industry is on board with this. I think the younger generation is, and I think it's something our party can be proud of, because honestly, what we're offering are common sense transitional solutions that are going to have the desired results. I mean, we are cleaning up our emissions now without all of this. Let's continue to do that.
Yeah, and you've also been a leader in this conversation about, should the Biden administration declare a climate emergency? Explain your role in that debate and why it's important to choose the path that you've chosen when it comes to promoting solutions and
well, I think we should disallow. Yeah, I think we should disallow that a climate emergency can be declared, because it's just not an objective standard here. If you have let's take the COVID emergency, for instance. Pretty obvious we had something going on here that was killing people and very difficult and not understandable. So President Trump declares a health emergency. I think we all accept that. Well, if you're going to have a climate emergency, what does that mean? Does that mean more rain, less rain, higher temperatures, lower temperatures, more wind, less wind? I mean, it's just hard. You can make it say whatever you want, but with that declaration of emergency comes enormous powers to the executive. And what this executive has already shown that they want to do through the regulatory environment is to go way beyond what Congress's desires are and put their own bias onto every regulation, onto every piece of legislation, even though it's been debated. We had this debate in the highway bill. We excluded a lot of things, and then the administration comes right back and puts them back on. That's a violation of what Congress's desire is. And this administration does this time and time again in a regulation. If this president in particular, were to have the ability to declare a climate emergency, hold on to your hat, because there is in my view, there are no extremes to which they would not go. And they'd have more power to be able to do it.
So your objection really is, it's that if the Biden administration, just to be clear with listeners, the Biden administration's desire to declare an emergency it isn't so much a commentary on the quote
No.
threat or risk assessment. It is a power grab, and it would actually make it more difficult to develop and win public support of durable solutions. So isn't the momentum behind your bill a great argument against the Biden administration's desire to declare a climate emergency?
Yes, yes, and you're right. It's not just a statement of, oh, we have a climate, and it is the powers that are granted to the president. For instance, you could forego certain regulations. You could forego cost benefits analysis. You could speed up certain deployment of funds for one reason or the other. I mean, it drops a lot of the checks and balances that are built into the system between the executive and the legislature, and it gives the executive, the president, the ability to skirt a lot of these. And to me, that would be a dangerous precedent to set, but also it could come with difficult consequences.
And on the Advance Act, what are the real problems this bill fixes, and how does it do it?
Well, what it does is right now, when people think of a nuclear power plant, for instance, they think of the old power plants with the huge towers with spent fuel and all the enormous security and great expense. The developing technology are smaller. You could put maybe on an old footprint 4 to 8 of these small nuclear reactors. You could put one in a small city and power the whole city if it became economically feasible. So we're pushing. So because we see the benefits of being able to deploy these small nuclear, we don't have the regulatory environment to be able to speed this along. In other words, I don't want to be talking about this in 15 years. We should already have units up and running by then, well before then. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as a body has been used to dealing with the old way of licensing and relicensing large power reactors. So it does part of that. It also gives incentives for people to invest in this. It's not exactly tax credits, but it is incentives for the innovation portion of nuclear development, and it also asserts global leadership, as I spoke about at the beginning, in the nuclear realm, so that I would rather have our American nuclear technology all around the world than have Chinese technology all over the world within. They have the power over that very valuable resource and power grid.
Right, and also isn't licensing reform a key part of this too? That
Yes.
if for somebody who wants to develop a nuclear small modular reactor, they could spend more on the licensing than they'd ever recoup in profits under the current regime.
Yes, and it's making sure that process actually moves with much more expedience.
And let's talk more about where can these be placed? You've talked about brownfields and other areas.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had discussions with other developers? Even I have a farm. I can actually see West Virginia I'm in Maryland, but I can see Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland from where I sit.
Oh.
Have you ever had discussions with local farmers in West Virginia about putting some of these small reactors on their land, where people want to be creative about their land use?
I think that's probably a dream of the future. I think where the discussions are now is that existing coal-fired power plants that have been decommissioned, where hundreds of people worked in that community, they're now no longer there. You can put modular reactors there. You can access the power grid from there because it's already been a power station, and you can reemploy all the people in the local area. Right. And so that I think is the first place to look. Through a DOE pilot program, that's happening now in the state of Wyoming, where they're taking an old coal-fired power plant and recommissioning it into a nuclear site. But nothing comes without stresses and strains. We have to do a lot of education here to the general public, because I think in some ways nuclear still has a bit of an asterisk beside it because of past accidents. These are different types of reactors and much more small and contained. And so we need to do work there before I would think any kind of deployment into a smaller type of industrial or agricultural part would take part.
And there's bipartisan support for that first step, which is significant.
Oh yeah, it's really I think it's the realization that baseload power is critical, and for those who are more on the absolute green side, end fossil fuels, there's no replacement for the power generation of natural gas and coal, but nuclear does have promise, and in some cases is not predominant, but is carrying a heavy load in certain areas. So, we need to look at common sense solutions, and one of them is if it's a really hot day or a really cold day, or if you grow a whole community, or if you get a big plant, you got to have the power to generate.
Right, and the energy density of nuclear is off the charts. In other words, you can produce far more energy per acre with nuclear than almost any other source of energy.
Right. The problem is affordability is a problem, same as it is with carbon capture, and affordable of the technology. And so that's why this Advance Act is so important, because I think it's going to push this technology a lot quicker, farther in the licensing of it, because you can't just have one small reactor and make that work. You got to have 3 and 4 before you get to the economies of scale.
And what has the reaction been with people in West Virginia? Do the light bulbs click off? Do they scratch their head and wonder why is Senator
Well, it's
Capito
interesting.
nuclear?
The history of our state is we actually had a prohibition on nuclear energy that was probably built into the state legislature during the big time, probably a coal recession, maybe into the 70s. And all of a sudden, maybe people started looking at different alternative power sources, and the coal industry, very powerful industry in our state, basically had it written into law that you could not build a nuclear facility and as a competitor. And so I think several years ago, the legislature came to realize that some of these abandoned coal transmission units that are either being retired, mostly because they're so old, 60, 70 years old, and the owners don't want to put the money into it to refurb them, so they just cancel them. They just sit there. So I think the legislature in their wisdom said, hey, we can cite nuclear there and have a power generation revenue source and an employer at the same time.
Well, that's exciting. And is there any indication from the administration that there's going to be pushback at the 11th hour on any of the particulars? It sounds like there's been a lot of work done over months and years on this piece of legislation.
Right. We've been working on this one for a while. My leadership position, and then also Sheldon Whitehouse on the Democrat side is known as one of the biggest environmentalists in the Senate. He's very much on board with this. So I think we have a good, anytime you can get a vote 16-3 in one of the most controversial committees is pretty good day.
Yeah, that's quite an accomplishment. Well, Senator, thank you. So is there anything else you want to add about the Advance Act that you think people ought to know about? That
No, I mean, the understanding is it's not all the way through. I mean, we still have to work this with the House to get it all the way through. But I think we feel confident that the Advance Act will stay in the bill, number one, and hopefully, because we pass the NDAA every single year, that the NDAA will pass as well.
That's great. Well, Senator, you can learn more, and the listeners can learn more about the Advance Act and small modular nuclear reactors, the nuclear industry, the regulatory fight at our news magazine, c3news.com. And we look forward to following this and having you back on.